Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. Picture this. You're doom scrolling at midnight, and depending on which feed you're in, America is either on fire or rising up. Both sides are certain. Both sides have video, and somehow they're watching the same events and seeing completely different countries. It's not a bug in our media system. For a lot of people, it's a feature. We've built an information environment that doesn't just reflect reality, it manufactures it, slices it into tribe-sized pieces, and serves each side exactly the outrage it was already hungry for. The result is we're not really disagreeing about politics anymore, we're disagreeing about what happened. And when you can't agree on basic facts, the space for actual conversation collapses. What's driving this isn't bad journalism or bad faith politicians, though there's plenty of both. A big part of it is something far older and more hardwired in us. The need to belong, to be on the right side, to feel morally superior to the people we've decided are the enemy. That instinct made sense when the enemy was a rival tribe across the river. It's a lot more destructive when it's your neighbor, your coworker, or your family member who voted differently. And that's what we're going to dig into today on the Outrage Overload podcast. How outrage spreads like a contagion. Why our tribal instincts make us so susceptible to it, and what it actually looks like to break free from the cycle. I'm your host, David Beckemeyer, and my guest today didn't come to this topic as a detached academic. She came to it the way most of us do, by living through it, getting pulled into the current, and then doing the hard work of asking why. Stay with us. Yeah, so Alison Sher, thank you so much for making time for our program.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
So, I'm curious about... And I heard you talk about this a little bit, but I think listeners will be interested in the story of what caused you to go down this path and really look into this problem. Is there a particular moment or something that was going on in your life?
Well, obviously the inspiration stemmed during the pandemic era, where I noticed the bifurcation of media creating outrage to such an overwhelming extent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had sort of a similar experience, although it wasn't just COVID. It was kind of everything going on at once, but yeah. So I wanted to dive in a little bit in the sort of you were there aspect of things, like you do some sort of boots on the ground type reporting in these kind of high tension spaces. So I wanted to ask a few questions about that. Can you paint us a picture, of sort of in these protests and activist movements? Can you paint us a picture of what that climate feels like on the ground compared to how it looks, from afar?
Well, for example, now during the COVID era, there weren't so many opportunities to be boots on the ground. But for example, I'll use the Black Lives Matter movement, which I think if you were tuned into conservative media, they made it seem like it was just riots and arson and angry mobs. But when I actually did go to a Black Lives Matter protest, what I saw were very inspirational displays of Black excellence. Also commemorating lives that had been lost legitimately to police brutality. So that was just one example. Now, during that time when I was not at the protest, I also heard gunshots coming out of my door, which I had never heard before in the neighborhood I was living in. So yes, what would the Democrats say? They're 92% peaceful. Or whatever it was, but yeah, I mean, they were 92% peaceful. I went there, and I was actually like, wow, I had in my head that this was going to be such an evil thing, but really there is a lot that's needed from the movement, and there's so much beauty in the Black community that the conservative media was not portraying a balanced portrait of. So and there was also other things that I would say on the liberal side, they weren't portraying the vibe. They were trying to have it wholly look a certain way. But that is a great example that if I wasn't boots on the ground, I would have had a much different perception in my mind around what was really going on in those protests.
Well, and I suspect whichever partisan media you pay attention to, you'd get a different perspective compared to kind of what's on the ground. What do you think folks on the left, sort of what they were seeing in the media compared to what you saw on the ground?
Well, a lot of emphasis on systemic racism and dismantling systems of oppression, which at that point in time felt pretty destabilizing. And I think created a lot of interracial tension and probably exacerbated violence. A lot of these calls to defund the police, which had impacts on crime rates around the country. And so they definitely had their policy agenda and the way that, in my perception, they were using the Black vote, as they tend to rely on to win elections, to really appeal to appearing sympathetic to that group's struggle.
So, we always, and I think, as you noted, as you're noting in your book and in your comments about how COVID was really sort of emblematic of this problem, how we start to, sort of associate our core identity with these issues sometimes. And I'm kind of wondering if you saw it like a phase where it like started off being more of a political position and became identity, or did it just start right off the bat as being like, this is my identity before I even really even understand the issue that well?
Yeah, I mean, I think people have different relationships to politics. Like I'm someone probably more so than people I know in my life. I naturally become quite embroiled. Um, my nervous system gets hijacked by it. I'll notice if I start going into one narrative around how the media is portraying it, I have to consciously engage myself with the opposing narrative, or else I will start to kind of crusade for that narrative, because I have a burning desire for social justice in my heart that I've just like had, and I think that that can also be incredibly self-destructive. So in this book, I really worked on creating a bipartisan analysis of some of the issues during the past 5 years that have embroiled a nation. But I would say that usually people identify with certain tribes. Oftentimes, I would say most of the time, the narrative is different to between tribes, right? And when there's a tribal battle occurring, it's going to become a battle of the narrative around who has the moral high ground in whatever conflict. So if you're able to identify with humanity rather than your tribe, then you can start to have a more balanced perspective and poke holes in the narrative that you have been fed by your tribe. But by and large, humanity is incredibly tribal. It's a deep biological instinct. So I think that those of us who have capacities to change our minds are probably going to go about seeking out contradictory information and playing devil's advocate with themselves and learning to empathize with other groups of people that we may have been taught to view as our oppressors. Um, and yeah, but not everyone has that capacity or instinct. And so I think that we will always have at least a percentage of the population who will create and perpetuate tribal warfare with one another. We're lucky in the US it's nonviolent for the most part. I mean, we do have escalating political violence in the country, but nothing compared to like the Middle East, which I just came back from. And then I'm like, wow, you're really embroiled in religious, tribal narratives that have inspired thousands of years of war. So, and they can't get out of it, you know? It's like very rare there's like a peacemaker inside of those environments.
Right, and it's not a path we want to be going down, although it seems like we're headed there.
Yeah, but podcasts like this, books like the one I write, let's try to talk some sense into people, right?
Right. Yeah, we often, on this show, we've often talked about the idea that, the news media isn't necessarily straight up telling you lies. Most of the time, they do that sometimes. But most of the time, it's more like something that you call kind of selective storytelling and what they leave out and how they spin what they do tell. Can you give a couple, examples so listeners kind of have some concrete examples of that thing where like the same movement sort of is told, has three different stories behind it?
Okay, so I'll use the war in Gaza. That's a great, right? The Jewish narrative is that it's not a genocide, it's a war. And the Muslim narrative is that it's a genocide that has been instigated via Western interests. And neither are wholly correct, and the perceived threat in the other in group is very real. Jews in the Middle East, other than in the state of Israel, really are not welcome. And there's also a lot of inequity, I guess you could say, and destruction that has been created from the Israeli state onto the Palestinian people. And that, I think Israelis can go through their own sort of brainwashing to justify the destruction that takes place because it's self-preservation, self-determination for the Jewish people. And the Muslim population they have issues with fundamentalist terrorism. Like, that is a reality, right? And the US and the West have invaded their lands and bombed, and there's a westernification of the world that they want to protect their culture from. I mean, like, these conflicts are very they're very like complex and elaborate. There's thousands of years of history involved, and both sides have their reasons to be convinced that the other side is trying to kill them. But it's harder for each person to take responsibility for their own ways that they're like self-perpetuating that violence because they're stuck in defense modes, right? So that's one very elaborate example. And since I just got back from the Middle East, it's like very fresh in my mind, and it opened my eyes a lot to like the reality and the tensions that are people are living with there.
Right, and we talk about some of the psychological drivers for that, or sort of this moral thing, like you mentioned before, where if I keep telling myself how bad the other side is, it makes it easier to justify, me thinking I'm on the right side. It's a validation that I've chosen the right thing, and so we kind of go seek out this somebody telling us all the outrageous things people on the other side are doing, so it keeps affirming that we made the right choice.
And we're in the morally superior in group, tribal in group like thought. Yeah, but yeah, I feel like I have transcended that through the process of writing this book.
Yeah, so I definitely want to we definitely want to cover some of that of how you transcend that. So I definitely want to talk about that a little bit. Well, let's just jump there now, I guess. So, you know, not everybody probably is prepared to write a book and do all the research that you've done, but maybe there's some ideas you have for folks as they're kind of navigating this. We talked earlier about sort of playing devil's advocate a little bit, which can be really hard. We don't see it a lot of times when we're even doing it. We don't even know what to play devil's advocate to because it's just like it's so ingrained. Things like that. So maybe you can talk a little bit about some of that.
Yeah, I think if you find yourself feeling very strongly about one narrative that you are encountering in the media. Yeah, just that if you do not want to be hijacked politically, and that's a value that you have, like you don't want to be politically, you don't want your brain to be politically captured by propaganda and narratives and hidden power interests, then the only way to do that is to explore alternative narratives and is to talk to people who see things differently. What was it? I read a statistic like 4 in 10 people are willing to end relationships over their person's like perception of what's going on in the Middle East right now, and the war in Gaza. So it's like if you're okay being one of those people, I'm not, because I have family members with different views than me. I have coworkers with different views than me, and I'm more oriented towards how can we build peace. But yeah, the only way to do that is to talk to people who are different than you, to search for sources that are different than you. You can't rely on ChatGPT because that has its own bias. You can't rely on the New York Times because that has its own bias. Um, you can't rely on people who work inside of institutions because they have their own bias, even if they're the ones working most directly with a certain problem that you're interested in. It's like it's really getting the whole picture that allows you to have some neutrality and a capacity to have a balanced perspective.
Yeah, but it's definitely a heavy lift, though, if we say we can't trust any institutions at all. I mean, certainly, I don't think we can trust like a single source for anything. But it's a pretty heavy lift to go, and also, not everybody has the skills. I mean, if you start going down the YouTube rabbit hole, or even podcast rabbit hole or whatever, you're not necessarily going to get good information all the time. Now, we have a mission and we try to really give good information here, but you're taking my word for it to some degree. And just like everybody else. So, I don't, it's a tough one there because not everybody has the skills to deal with that.
And not everybody has the time,
Right.
So,
Yeah, for sure.
and nor should they. But I think there are certain members of society that very much feel called to disseminate information and to be a part of uplifting narratives.
So speaking of sort of the uplifting side, was there a moment somewhere along in this work where you felt, it's not hopeless, like people are able to talk to each other?
Yeah, I think that so as part of my book release, I facilitated almost like town hall discussions on certain issues that were talked about in the book, and everyone was able to have a very peaceful conversation, even if it was people who were talking who were subscribing to narratives differently than theirs, and people were talking about, wow, I really wish we had more forums like this to discuss these things one-on-one versus going online to do it, which is probably a terrible place and breeds polarization. And people will say things that they would never say to your face. Then now you have like an added variable of AI bots instigating political rage with people, and so yeah, it's also like don't believe like the world online and the polarization that we perceive inside of society online is not an accurate reflection of actually like one-on-one what we're capable of as individuals.
Right, or even what the real polarization is, right? I mean, loudest voices really dominate all those online spaces, so everybody has a misperceived, and the more moderate voices kind of roll out because they just get attacked by people on all sides, so they kind of just aren't there, like they're not participating in a lot of those conversations. So we're not getting a good role model for that, and we're not getting, certainly not getting a good role model for how to have civil dialogue, right? Because those loud voices kind of take over. So, all right. So let's say that if we take this kind of metaphor of kind of emotional hygiene of a contagion, and somehow some kind of a hygiene against it, what would you leave listeners with as sort of a practical way to resist this infection?
Well, for some people, it's going to be just to disengage entirely, and I'm okay with that. I know some people have judgments around that, but I also I truly accept that for some people, that is their activism, is to be like, I'm not going to allow this to alter my enjoyment of my own experience in the world. And in that way, like, they're kind of not causing any harm. And I know other people would be like, okay, people who are very morally outraged on Trump and things that are happening inside of the US right now, and making parallels to like Nazi Germany or other fascist revolutions. And they're like, it's your moral high ground to stand up. I also I empathize with that like sometimes if we don't mobilize as a collective, that bad things can happen that were preventable with like action and things like that. So those are two different philosophies. I'm not going to say one's better than the other, but I think we need to take appropriate action, and that can only happen with like accurate information. And so to almost like vaccinate yourself against the social contagions, right? This kind of diligence in sense making is needed. And for me, I've taken a stance in this book of neutrality, trying to bring back, revive journalistic standards around writing unbiased information inside of like narratives and things like that, because that feels like a form of activism. And there will also be times where people feel like I really have to like declare a side and choose a narrative as the actual reality of what's happening in the situation, like a narcissist and an empath. And these things happen on the micro level as well, interpersonally, where we're like, I'm being gaslit and I don't know what's real and I can't tell my ass from my elbow. And in some ways, like, people will say that that is what's going on a macro level, is like we have like psychopaths ruling us. But in my own perception, I don't see one side or another on a political level as being outside of that, like, kind of evil, an agenda. They might be slightly different agendas, and one might be the lesser of two evils, but to subscribe to the narrative of the person that you think is the lesser of two evils still is a social contagion. Does that make sense?
A little bit, but what option does that leave people? I mean, I guess, we're talking about reforms, that would have to be made so we have better options than the sort of two-party options we have today, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely something that needs to happen, because whenever you have a system where the person who wins an election usually comes down to like a 1%
or less.
Yeah, difference. And the narratives have said that, convinced one side that the other side is essentially trying to kill them. Yeah, you're like, to have that like elegant third option, or like a voice that unites people, is what probably the world needs. And inside of the political engine, those voices tend to, barely get any momentum. So I think that is something that we find ourselves in. And until we find a way to platform alternative voices like that, this is probably going to be the reality that we have to live with around, domestic politics. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, Alison Sher, thank you so much for making time for our program. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
It was great to be here, and everyone look up my book, The Social Contagion, if you're interested on the rise of radical politics in the US since COVID and ways that we can create a shared narrative um, of just allowing all the information that we've been bombarded with over the past few years to have a place to be worked through. So, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll definitely have links to your website and to the book. So yeah, we'll definitely get that out there. And once again, it's The Social Contagion.
The subtitle is Viral Ideologies and the Culture War for America's Future.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks again. I really appreciate it, and I enjoyed speaking with you.
Yes, thank you.
That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. Outrage Overload is a Connors Institute podcast. The Connors Institute for Nonpartisan Research and Civic Engagement at Shippensburg University works to disseminate high-quality, nonpartisan information to the American public around issues of societal well-being, democracy promotion, and news literacy. If you found this episode valuable, please share it or leave a review. It really helps. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.